The night was cold, and the wind moved like knives across the barren land. In the middle of that empty place walked a woman, tall and strong, her steps heavy with shame. Her name was Lyra, and she once lived among her people in the bright village of Treshna. But tonight she was no longer one of them. Behind her, the voices of the villagers still echoed in her mind. She is too big, too strange. No male will ever want her, they had said. Some had even laughed as they threw stones near her feet, not to hurt her but to make sure she kept walking away. Every step she took felt like a knife twisting in her heart. They had not just rejected her body, they had rejected her dream. From the time she was young, Lyra had wished only one thing: to hold a child of her own, to sing the songs of mothers, to whisper comfort in the dark, but the elders had declared it impossible. They said her body was too large, too unnatural for their kind. They said she would never bear life, and so she was unworthy. The stars above were sharp and cold. She looked up at them, hoping for comfort, but they gave her none. The sky stretched endless, reminding her how small she truly was. Even though her body was bigger than most women of her people, her heart felt smaller than ever before. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the cold pushed in deeper. Her feet carried her past the last torches of the village. Once the light was gone, only shadows remained. The ground was uneven, sharp rocks cutting her skin, but she did not stop. Her tears mixed with the dust on her face. She whispered to herself, "If I am not a daughter, not a mother, then what am I?" Hunger soon joined the cold. Her people had given her nothing. No food, no water, not even a blanket. They wanted her gone, forgotten, erased. Her stomach turned with pain, but she walked on. She feared if she stopped, the darkness itself would swallow her. For hours she wandered. The only sound was the crunch of her feet on the earth and the soft sobs she could not control. In her chest, hope was dying. Each breath she took was heavy. Her mind asked the same question again and again. Why was I made this way? Why was I given a heart that longs for children if I was never meant to have them? At last her legs weakened. She fell to her knees, the dirt biting her skin. Around her the land was silent. Only the cry of some far night creature touched her ears. Lyra pressed her forehead to the ground and closed her eyes. Maybe this is the end, she thought. Maybe the earth will take me and the pain will end. But then, a faint glow in the distance, she lifted her head slowly, afraid it was only her mind playing tricks. No, it was real. A small flicker, orange and warm, of fire. Her heart jumped. If there was fire, there was life. Someone must be there. Fear struck her at the same time. What if it was another of her people, waiting to chase her away again? Or worse, what if it was a beast, drawn by the same hunger that burned her stomach, but something stronger than fear pulled her forward? The need to survive, the tiny flame of hope that had not yet died. She pushed herself up, her body shaking. Every step toward the light was a battle. Her breath came hard, her vision blurred. Still she walked. The fire grew brighter. She could smell smoke in the air, the sweet promise of warmth. At last, she reached the edge of a small clearing. There it was, a campfire, flames dancing against the dark. Beside it sat a figure different from her people. The shape was smaller, the skin pale, the clothes rough and strange. It was a human. Lyra froze. Her people had told stories of humans. Some said they were dangerous, greedy, untrustworthy. Others said they were stubborn, kind and brave. She did not know which was true. And yet in that moment, all she saw was a man by a fire, a man with warmth she did not have. Her legs gave out. She stumbled into the clearing. The man turned, his hand reaching for something beside him, a weapon maybe. His eyes narrowed. She raised her hands weakly, her voice breaking. "Please," she whispered. "I have nowhere else." The human did not move for a moment. The firelight caught his face, showing lines of weariness, but also something else. His gaze softened as he saw the tears and the dirt that covered her. She sank to the ground near the fire, her body too weak to stand. The man hesitated, watching her. He did not know her story, did not know her pain, yet something in her eyes held him, something deeper than words. She was not a threat. She was simply broken, and in that silence, with fire crackling between them, the path of both their lives began to change. The flames cracked gently, throwing sparks into the night sky. The human man, whose name was Elias, held his old rifle close. His life on the borderlands had taught him to trust no shadow, trust no stranger. Yet as he looked at the woman who had stumbled into his firelight, he felt something different stirring inside. Her body shook with cold, her skin marked with dust and bruises. She was not armed, not dangerous. She only looked lost. Elias kept the rifle in his hands but lowered its barrel. His eyes studied her carefully. Her chest rose and fell in painful gasps. Her lips cracked from thirst. She looked less like a threat and more like a soul on the edge of death. The silence stretched between them, only the fire filled it with its soft hiss and crackle. At last Elias spoke, his voice low and guarded. "Who are you?" he asked. The woman lifted her head slowly, her eyes wet with tears. "My name is Lyra," she whispered. I was cast out." He frowned. He had heard tales of aliens being exiled, but this one was different. She seemed proud in her features, yet broken in her heart. Elias did not understand her kind fully, but the word "cast out" weighed heavily. He knew too well what it meant to lose everything. Still, trust was a hard thing. He pointed the rifle closer to the ground, not at her, but not far either. "Why here? Why come to me?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I had nowhere else." Her voice cracked and she lowered her gaze. "I saw your fire, I thought maybe." Her words fell away into the wind. Elias's jaw tightened. He could hear the desperation in her voice. He remembered long winters when he himself had nearly starved, when only the kindness of a stranger had kept him alive. Without that, he might not be here at all. He lowered the rifle fully, letting it rest against the log beside him. Lyra's eyes widened at the small gesture. For her, it was not just a weapon being set down, it was a sign that she was no longer alone. Elias stood and moved slowly, pulling a heavy cloak from his pack. He stepped closer, his boots crunching in the dirt. She flinched at his movement, but he simply placed the cloak over her shoulders. Warmth rushed into her body. Her eyes closed as if she had stepped into a dream. The coarse fabric scratched her skin, but it was the gentlest thing she had felt in weeks. She whispered a quiet, "Thank you," her voice trembling. Elias sat back down, keeping his distance but watching her carefully. He reached into his pack again and pulled out a small tin cup, filling it with water from his flask. He held it out. "Drink," he said. His words were short, firm, but his eyes carried no cruelty. Her hands shook as she took it. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. Elias almost smiled at the sight, but he kept his face hard. He had learned not to show too much, not too soon. Still, in his chest, something softened. When she finished, she placed the cup down gently, her fingers lingering as if she feared it might vanish. Elias noticed. He saw the way she moved carefully, as if every small kindness was something fragile that could be stolen from her. He had seen that look before, in orphans, in widows, in those who had lost more than they could bear. The night grew deeper, and the cold pressed harder against the camp. Elias added more wood to the fire. Its light painted both their faces in shades of gold and shadow. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence was heavy but not empty. It was the silence of two strangers caught between fear and trust. Finally, Elias asked again, "Why did they cast you out?" His tone was not sharp, not mocking, simply curious. Lyra's hands clenched under the cloak. She turned her face away, staring into the flames. For a long time she said nothing. Then, her voice broke. "They said I was too large to be a mother. They said no man would want me. They said I was useless." The words hung in the air like knives. Elias stared at her. His hands tightened. His people had exiled him once too. not for his size, but for his refusal to fight in a war he did not believe in. He had built his life here alone because there was nowhere else for him. Her pain echoed his in ways neither could yet understand. "You came to the wrong man," he muttered softly, though his voice was heavy with something else. "I am no savior." But even as he said it, his actions betrayed him. He reached into his pack again, pulling out a small loaf of bread, rough and dry. He tossed it toward her. "Eat," he said. Lyra's eyes widened. She caught it with both hands, staring at it as if it were made of gold. Slowly, she took a bite, the bread hard but warm in her mouth. Tears slid down her cheeks as she chewed. For the first time in days, her hunger quieted. Elias looked away into the night, hiding his expression. He told himself he was only helping her because it was the right thing, because leaving her to die in the cold would make him no better than the people who had once abandoned him. But deep inside, a spark had already been lit, one he did not want to admit to. Not yet. The fire burned steady between them. Two strangers, bound not by choice but by need. Yet in that moment under the cold stars, something fragile and new began to grow. Not trust, not love, not yet, but the first breath of something greater. The night passed slowly. The fire burned lower and lower until only glowing embers remained. Elias stayed awake, his hand resting near his rifle, yet his eyes often drifted toward Lyra. She sat close to the fire, wrapped in his cloak, her body curled like a child's. The shadows of her face showed deep exhaustion, but also something else, a strange peace she had not felt in a long time. When the first pale light of morning touched the sky, Elias finally stood. He stretched his tired limbs, the weight of years of solitude heavy on his shoulders. For so long he had lived only for the farm, for survival, never for another soul. Yet now, an alien woman sat at his fire, fragile and lost, and he could not bring himself to push her away. "Come," he said quietly, his voice rough from the cold air. Lyra stirred, her eyes opening slowly. She blinked as if unsure if she was still alive. Elias picked up his pack and rifle, pointing toward the hills. "My cabin is not far," he said. She hesitated, fear flashing in her eyes, but he added, "You will not last another night out here." Her legs trembled when she stood. The cloak hung loosely around her shoulders, hiding the dirt and bruises. She nodded without words and followed. Each step on the frozen ground was hard, but the thought of shelter pulled her forward. The walk was quiet. Elias did not ask questions and Lyra did not speak. She kept her eyes low, focusing only on the steady rhythm of his boots. There was something comforting in his silence, unlike her people, who had filled her ears with cruel laughter and whispers. This silence felt steady, strong, safe. At last they reached a small wooden cabin at the edge of the trees. Smoke rose faintly from a stone chimney. The cabin was old but solid, built by rough hands that knew the land. Elias opened the door and motioned for her to step inside. The air inside was warmer. The smell of dried herbs and wood smoke lingered. Lyra looked around in awe. It was simple. A wooden table, a chair, a small bed covered with rough blankets, shelves lined with jars of preserved food. Nothing like the shining halls of her people, but there was no cruelty in these walls. Only work and survival. "You can sit," Elias said, pulling out the chair. She lowered herself carefully, her hands resting in her lap. He moved about the room with practiced steps, placing logs in the small stove, filling a pot with water. Soon the sound of boiling filled the silence, and the smell of soup spread slowly through the cabin. Lyra's eyes closed. She could not remember the last time she had smelled food cooking. Her heart ached with both hunger and gratitude. When Elias set a bowl in front of her, steam rising from it, she almost wept. She ate slowly at first, afraid it might be taken away. But when he did not stop her, she let herself eat fully. Elias sat across from her, chewing on his own bread. He watched her without judgment, only quiet thought. He had seen starving men before, desperate refugees who came through the borderlands. He knew that look in her eyes, the look of someone who had been given nothing for too long. When the meal was done, Lyra placed the bowl down carefully. Her voice trembled. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why help me?" Elias leaned back, his gaze steady. "Because you are alive," he said simply, "and no one deserves to be left to die." Her eyes filled with tears. Her people had said she was worthless, yet here sat a man, a human, who gave her food and warmth without demand. She wiped her eyes quickly, ashamed to cry again, but Elias only looked at her with quiet patience. The day passed with simple tasks. Elias chopped wood outside while Lyra stayed near the fire, her body still weak, yet her mind slowly calmed. She watched him through the window, his arms swinging with steady rhythm, his breath rising in mist. There was no mockery in his movements, no judgment, he simply worked, and for some reason that comforted her. Later he showed her how to grind dried herbs into powder for storage. She fumbled with the tools, her large hands clumsy compared to his, but he did not laugh. He guided her gently, his rough hands steadying. Hers, she felt a warmth spread in her chest, a strange warmth she had thought she would never feel again. As the sun set, the cabin glowed golden with firelight. Lyra sat wrapped in the cloak again, watching Elias repair a broken wooden handle. For the first time in many nights, her heart was not heavy with shame. Instead, she felt a fragile sense of belonging. Before sleep, she whispered almost to herself, "Your home is small, but it is kind." Elias looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "Home is not walls," he said, his voice calm. "It is what you do inside them." She stared at him, the words echoing in her heart. For her, home had always been a place of rejection, but here, in this small cabin, she felt the first spark of something different. That night, as she lay on the floor near the stove wrapped in blankets Elias had given her, she listened to the wind outside. It no longer sounded like knives, no longer threatened to cut her apart. Instead, it was only wind, while inside she was safe, for the first time in what felt like forever, Lyra slept without fear. The morning came quietly. Pale sunlight slipped through the cracks of the wooden cabin. Elias was already awake, splitting logs outside, the sharp sound of his axe carrying through the still air. Inside, Lyra stirred from her place near the stove. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. For a moment she forgot where she was, but then the smell of smoke and the sight of the small cabin reminded her. She was no longer in the village, no longer among the cruel eyes of her people. She stood carefully, her body still sore but stronger than the night before. She watched Elias through the small window. His movements were steady, his face calm. She wondered how a man who lived alone in this cold land could carry himself with such quiet strength. A question rose in her heart. Why would such a man help someone like her? Later, as they ate bread and dried fruit at the table, silence filled the space again. Elias rarely spoke unless he needed to, and Lyra's voice was still weak from years of being silenced. Yet the silence was not empty. It was heavy with words unsaid. Finally, Elias asked in his rough but steady tone, "What happened?" His eyes stayed on the table, but his question was meant for her. Lyra's hands tightened around the small piece of bread she held. Her throat felt dry. She looked at the fire instead of him. "They said I was wrong," she whispered at last. "From the day I grew taller than the others, from the day my shoulders grew broad and my steps heavy, they whispered." Her voice shook, but once the words began, they could not be stopped. "They said I was too large, too strange. They said no man would choose me. They said I could never bear children." Her eyes filled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I tried to believe it was not true. I prayed. I begged the elders. I asked the healers, but they all said the same." Her voice cracked. "They cast me out. They told me I was useless. They said my dreams were foolish." The words poured like broken glass from her lips, cutting her each time she spoke them. Elias listened in silence, his jaw clenched, his hands resting on the table. He did not interrupt. He did not tell her to stop. He let her voice carry the pain that had been locked inside for so long. Lyra pressed her palms to her eyes, ashamed of the tears. "I only wanted to be a mother," she whispered. "I only wanted to hold life in my arms, to sing the songs my own mother sang to me, but they said I was cursed." Her body shook, her breath uneven. Elias leaned back, his eyes dark. For a moment he was not in the cabin, but in his own past. He remembered the day his people had turned from him, not because of size, not because of children, but because he had refused to fight in their war. They had called him a coward, worthless. He had been left to wander until he built his life in the borderlands. He understood too well what it meant to be cast aside. He spoke finally, his voice low but firm. "They were wrong." Lyra looked up, her tears still falling. Elias met her eyes, his own steady. "Your worth is not measured by them. It is not measured by what they say you cannot do." Her lips parted, disbelief on her face. "But I am different," she said. "I cannot be what they expect. I cannot give what they demand." Elias shook his head slowly. "Difference is not weakness," he said. "It is strength. They could not see it, but I do." The words struck her like a sudden light in the dark. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked at her without judgment. For years she had carried their voices inside her. But here was a human, a stranger, who spoke as if she was not broken. Lyra lowered her gaze, unable to hold his eyes. Her heart ached, not with pain, but with something she had forgotten long ago. Hope. She wiped her cheek slowly, her hands trembling. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you say such things?" Elias looked into the fire, his voice quiet. "Because I know what it is to be cast out. I know what it is to be told you are nothing. But I also know it is a lie." The room grew still. Only the fire crackled. Lyra's chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths, but a warmth spread slowly where there had only been cold. She looked at Elias again, this time with different eyes. She saw not only a man, but someone who carried his own scars. Someone who understood as the day passed. Lyra helped grind more herbs. She moved slower than Elias, but her hands grew steadier. He guided her with quiet patience. When she spilled some powder, she gasped in fear, expecting anger. But Elias only brushed it aside. "It happens," he said, simple as that. Those small moments spoke louder than any grand words. To Lyra, every gesture, every patient glance, was proof that kindness could exist without condition. That night, as the fire burned bright, she sat close to it, whispering quietly to herself, "Maybe I am not cursed." The thought frightened her, but it also gave her strength. Elias, sitting across the room repairing tools, looked at her without speaking. He saw the change in her eyes, the shift from despair to a fragile hope. He did not smile, but in his chest something eased. The cabin, once silent and lonely, now carried whispers, not of cruelty, but of healing. Not all wounds were gone, but for the first time they were not bleeding in silence. The days slowly turned into weeks. Winter's grip on the land did not loosen, but inside Elias's cabin there was warmth, not only from the fire, but from the presence of two souls learning to live side by side. Lyra was no longer a stranger sitting silently in the corner. She was now part of the daily rhythm. Elias rose early each morning, as he always had, chopping wood, checking traps, tending to the small animals in the pen outside. At first, Lyra only watched, her body still weak, but soon she began to join him. She carried water from the stream, gathered kindling, and even helped feed the animals. Her large hands, once a source of shame, were strong and steady for work. Elias noticed, though he said little. One cold morning, Elias found her kneeling beside a lamb that had stumbled onto the icy ground. She cradled it carefully, whispering softly. Her voice was gentle, filled with a tenderness that Elias had not expected. The lamb calmed in her arms, its small legs kicking weakly. Elias watched from a distance, a strange ache stirring in his chest. He had seen many people handle animals roughly, but she treated them as if they were fragile treasures. That night, as they sat by the fire, he asked quietly, "Have you always cared for creatures like that?" She blinked at him, surprised by the question. Yes, she whispered. Even when I was young, I loved to hold the small ones, to sing to them, but my people laughed. They said someone, like me, was not meant to cradle life. Elias's gaze lingered on her. The firelight glowed against her silver eyes, and he saw not the broken outcast she believed herself to be, but a woman with a heart large enough to shelter even the smallest lives. He did not say this aloud, but the thought stayed with him long into the night. Slowly, laughter began to return, to the cabin, not loud or constant, but soft and unexpected. The first time Lyra laughed, it startled even her. She had spilled flour while learning to bake bread, the fine powder covering her face. Elias raised a brow, and she laughed nervously. The sound was fragile but beautiful. Elias felt something stir again, something he had buried for years. The bond between them was not spoken. It grew in the quiet moments, in the way she passed him tools without being asked, in the way he set an extra log on the fire before she sat near it, in the way they both began to share meals without the heavy silence of strangers. One evening, snow fell thick against the cabin windows. The wind howled like wolves outside, but inside the fire burned strong. Elias sat sharpening his axe while Lyra mended a torn blanket. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Elias asked softly, "Do you still dream of being a mother?" Her hands froze on the fabric. Her eyes dropped to the thread in her lap. "Every night," she whispered. "But dreams are cruel. They remind me of what I was told I cannot be." Elias looked at her steadily. "Dreams are not cruel," he said. "People are. Dreams are hope. They keep us alive." Lyra's throat tightened. His words struck her deeper than she wanted to admit. She looked at him through the flickering firelight. "And you?" she asked carefully. "Do you dream?" Elias's eyes darkened. For a moment he seemed far away. "I once dreamed of a family," he said quietly. "But the war took that. My people turned from me. I built this life because there was nothing else left." The silence after his words was heavy, but not empty. For the first time, Lyra understood the weight he carried, just as he had begun to understand hers. Their pains were different, but the emptiness they shared was the same. As days passed, they worked together more. Elias taught her how to plant herbs in small pots to grow even in the cold. She showed him how to weave strands of grass into small ropes, a skill from her people. He was patient with her mistakes, and she was gentle with his stubbornness. Slowly, they filled the spaces in each other's lives. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, fierce and sudden. The wind slammed against the cabin, snow blinding the world outside. Inside, the roof groaned under the weight of the storm. Elias climbed up to secure it, but the ladder slipped in the ice. He nearly fell, but Lyra rushed forward, her strong hands grabbing him with ease. She held him steady until the danger passed. Her strength, the very thing her people had mocked, had saved him. When they returned inside, dripping with cold, Elias looked at her differently. "Your strength is not a curse," he said firmly. "It is a gift." Her eyes filled. She turned away quickly, but the words sank deep into her soul. That night, when the storm raged hardest, they sat closer to the fire. The flames painted their faces in gold. Lyra whispered softly, "Perhaps strength can hold life as well as gentleness." Elias nodded, his eyes steady. "Yes," he said. "Perhaps it can." The bond between them was no longer fragile silence. It was something stronger, something beginning to root itself deep. They were no longer two broken souls surviving alone. They were two hearts slowly learning that healing could come not in grand moments, but in small, quiet ones shared by firelight. The snow began to soften as the days passed. The long nights were still cold, but the edge of winter slowly broke. Streams thawed, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the forest. For Lyra, each day inside the cabin felt like a step into a new world. She was no longer shivering with hunger, no longer walking alone through endless darkness. She had warmth, food, and most of all, she had someone who did not turn her away. Elias kept his usual routine. He worked with steady discipline, repairing fences, tending to the animals, preparing the land for planting. Yet something had changed. He no longer worked in silence. His eyes often sought Lyra, watching how she moved through the cabin, how she carried herself. For years his life had been a cycle of survival, but now his world carried another rhythm, the rhythm of two, not one. One morning, as sunlight spilled weakly through the window, Lyra helped Elias scatter feed for the chickens. She bent down to lift one gently, its tiny body nestled against her chest. She smiled, a soft and rare smile. Elias paused, leaning on the fence. He watched her with a strange stillness. Her laughter, quiet but real, carried across the yard. "You have the hands of a mother," Elias said without thinking. His voice was low but certain. Lyra froze. Her heart stopped at the words. She looked at him, wide-eyed, as if he had spoken a forbidden truth. "Do not mock me," she whispered, her voice breaking. He stepped closer, shaking his head. "I am not mocking," he said firmly. "I see it. I see how you hold life, how you care. Do not let their voices tell you otherwise." Tears stung her eyes. She turned away, pressing her forehead against the small bird. Her people's words came rushing back, harsh and heavy. But Elias's voice cut through them, steady and unshaken. She had been told she was cursed, but here stood a man who told her she was more. Later that evening, as they sat by the fire, Lyra finally spoke of the dream she had locked away. "When I was a child," she whispered, "I used to pretend I had little ones of my own. I would hold stones or sticks and sing to them. I would imagine their tiny hands in mine. But when I grew too tall, too strong, they laughed. They said no child could ever belong to me." Her tears fell. "So I stopped dreaming." Elias listened, his eyes steady. "A dream does not die because others laugh," he said softly. "A dream dies only if you let it. And I do not see death in your eyes. I see fire." Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but fear clung to her heart. "And if they were right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "If I was made wrong?" Elias leaned forward, his voice quiet but strong. "There is no wrong in you, only strength they could not understand. You are not broken. Lyra, you are more than they could ever see." The fire cracked between them. Lyra's tears spilled freely, but this time they were not only of pain, they carried something else. Release. For years she had carried the chains of their judgment, and here was a man cutting through them with simple, steady words. That night, she lay awake near the stove, her eyes open to the ceiling beams above. For the first time in years, her mind dared to shape the old dream again. She imagined small hands reaching for her, imagined the sound of laughter filling the cabin, imagined herself holding life close, not as an outcast but as a mother. The thought frightened her, but it also warmed her. She placed her hand gently on her chest and whispered. Perhaps, over the next days, the bond between her and Elias grew stronger. They worked together in harmony. He showed her how to plant seeds in the thawing soil. She knelt in the dirt, her hands covered in earth. Her people had once mocked her for her size, but here, her strength made the work easier, Elias noticed, and each time he looked at her, his gaze softened. One afternoon, a small group of children from a nearby human settlement came to the farm. Their parents traded herbs with Elias. While the adults spoke, the children ran into the yard, chasing each other, laughing. Lyra stood frozen as she watched them. Her heart pounded. A little girl stumbled and scraped her knee, crying out. Without thinking, Lyra rushed forward. She knelt, her large hands surprisingly gentle as she wiped the dirt from the girl's skin. She whispered softly, and the child's tears slowed. Elias watched from the distance, his eyes fixed on Lyra. The girl clung to her, refusing to let go until her mother called her back. When the family left, Elias walked to Lyra. She stood still, her hands shaking, her eyes wide. "You see," he said quietly, "you were made to hold life." Lyra's throat closed. She turned to him, her voice trembling. Then why could they not see it? Elias looked at her, his face calm but fierce. Because they were blind, he said. But I see it, and you must see it too. For the first time, she did. The dream she had buried deep under shame was rising, fragile but alive. It was no longer a wound. It was a spark. She pressed her hand to her chest again, her eyes wet but shining. The dream of motherhood, once a cruel torment, now glowed like fire inside her. And this time, she did not let it die. Spring arrived slowly in the borderlands. The snow melted into streams that ran through the forest. Grass pushed its way up through the frozen earth. The world, once white and lifeless, now showed colors again. For Lyra, each change in the season felt like a reflection of her own heart. She too was thawing, breaking free from the long winter of shame. Elias worked beside her every day. Their lives had become one rhythm, planting, feeding, repairing. When he lifted heavy beams, she steadied them with her strong arms. When she carried water, he walked beside her. Their hands sometimes touched, not by plan, but by the closeness of their work, and each touch left a warmth that lingered long after. At night they sat by the fire. Their words grew more than before, no longer only about tasks or chores, but about small things, about childhood memories, about dreams left behind, about hopes they barely dared to voice. Slowly the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was gentle, filled with quiet, understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with gold, Elias returned from the fields to find Lyra sitting near the cabin with a child from the nearby village. The little boy laughed as she showed him how to weave strands of grass into a small rope. Her large fingers moved carefully, and the boy looked at her with wonder. When his mother came to collect him, he hugged Lyra tightly before leaving. Elias stood watching, his chest heavy. The sight of her with the boy filled him with something he could not name. Lyra turned and caught his gaze. Her face softened and she whispered. For a moment it felt real. Elias walked closer, his voice low but certain. It was real. Later that night, when the boy's laughter still echoed, in her mind Lyra asked softly, Elias, do you ever think that I could truly be a mother? Her voice trembled as if afraid of the answer. Elias placed another log on the fire, watching the sparks rise. I do not think it, he said firmly. I know it. You already are one in spirit. Your heart has carried the love of a mother all along. It only needed a place to grow. Her tears spilled freely. But these were not the bitter tears of old. They were warm, filled with light. She covered her face with her hands, whispering, You do not know what your words mean to me. Elias's eyes softened. I know, he said quietly, because once I thought my dreams were dead too, but you have given them back to me. Their eyes met across the fire. For a long moment the world outside disappeared. The storm of the past, the cruelty of her people, the silence of his exile, all of it faded, leaving only two souls who had found each other in the emptiness. The following days carried new energy. Together they planted rows of seeds. Elias showed her how to care for each one, telling her that patience and love made things grow. Lyra listened closely, not just to his words about the soil, but to the truth hidden inside them. She began to see herself as the soil, wounded but ready, waiting for life to take root. One afternoon, as they rested by the stream, Elias said something that made her heart stop. Lyra, he murmured, his voice quiet. I think you were not cast aside to die. I think you were sent to find me. She looked at him with wide eyes, her throat too tight to speak. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, not forceful, not demanding, but with a steady warmth. The bond between them had grown in silence and firelight, but now it stood clear. Elias was not just her shelter, not just her companion. He was the one who had given her back her dream. In his presence, she no longer saw herself as cursed. She saw herself as whole. Weeks later, the first sprouts broke through the soil. Small green shoots reached toward the sky. Lyra knelt beside them, her fingers brushing their fragile stems, her eyes filled with awe. Life, she whispered. Elias stood behind her, his voice steady. Yes, life, and it grows because of your hands. Her heart swelled. She turned to him, her tears shining. Perhaps one day I will hold life in my arms too. Elias looked at her, his gaze firm. You will, he said. And when that day comes, you will not be alone. The promise hung in the air, not as a dream, but as truth. Lyra believed it for the first time without fear. That night, as the stars filled the sky, she stood outside the cabin, Elias beside her. The world was vast and endless, but she no longer felt small. She was no longer the outcast of the village. She was a woman reborn. A woman whose dream of motherhood had been made real not by her people's judgment, but by the kindness of a human who saw her worth. In the glow of the firelight and the whisper of the night wind, their lives stretched forward into tomorrow. The path was uncertain, but together they carried a promise of family, of love, of life. The outcast had become the mother in spirit, and her tomorrow was no longer empty. It was full, shining with hope.